Welcome, everybody. Today, we hope to waste your time and we'll use it very efficiently. So thanks for joining us. If you joined us last Wednesday, the 13th, there was quite a bit of trash talking. We learned about the system of waste at MIT. And today we're going to jump into smart garbage. How are we evolving that system that we learned about the first time? And for those of you who may be saying, but I didn't join you the first time, I missed it. Not a worry at all. You're all quick studies. Some of you may be undergrads who've never stepped foot on campus, and it's not a worry because everybody consumes some things and everybody at some point wastes some things. And so we are all part of this problem, but we can also all be part of the solution. And so we will walk through some of the key findings from the first session, and I'm sure everybody, we welcome you to jump in, to join with us, to explore with us, and to learn together. So everybody is welcome. Next slide, Nicole. So today, what we're going to be walking through is a look at kind of how are we using and starting to generate kind of some of the data to help us better understand waste. Our goal for the day is to continue to build community among all of us trash talkers, to gain a sense of the challenges that we're all facing, but also the opportunities. And as we've started off with some trivia, the hope is to have some fun. Today, we'll talk through how is MIT beginning to understand data around waste? What are we learning about some of this waste data about MIT? And what are we doing with it? And hopefully each one of you will walk away with some kind of practice or idea that might influence your behavior at home and as we return to campus. We'll get into a bit more of the content in a few minutes. I'm going to hand off to Susie, who will help set the frame of how we're all working together here as a community today.
Thanks, Brian. So for those who joined us the last time, these should be just a reminder. And for those, again, that Brian said might be joining us for the first time, welcome aboard. And this is just a reminder of some community guidelines. So we will be recording this session for those who couldn't attend. We just ask that during the interactive parts that we just share the space. So if you find yourself talking a lot, maybe take a step back. If you find yourself a little bit nervous to talk, just always feel free to step forward. Listen respectively and actively, commit to learning and not debating. And if you're comfortable and willing, we encourage people to update their Zoom name with their pronouns. So if you click on the little dots next to your name, you should see an option to rename yourself and you can add there. And then type questions into the chat as we go. So obviously in the digital sphere, it's a little bit harder to sort of raise your hand and jump in and ask a question, but you're all probably well acquainted with the chat function now. So type your questions in. We have a lot of resident experts on hand today, all of us, and including Ruth Davis, who presented last time. And so she can obviously speak to the Office for Recycling and Materials Management and can also answer questions about custodial services and so forth. So thank you, Ruth, for joining us. And again, type those questions into the chat as we go. Next slide. So to get us started, we like to, again, part of the fun of this, part of the learning is just being in community with each other. So as we did the last time, we wanted to start off by just getting to know each other a little bit better, taking the time to answer a question with our small groups, and then we'll come back and do a small reflection before we jump right in. So we're going to put folks into small groups in a moment. We're going to give you 5-6-ish minutes to talk. So just introduce yourself, maybe say whether you're a student or a researcher or faculty staff, and then just maybe offer one habit. So that could be, hey, I save my avocado pits and I plant them. A resource, so maybe a podcast you listen to or an article you read, or a wish that you might want to share about waste or sustainability. So that will be your prompt. We'll put that prompt into the chat as well. And then we'll give you about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and you can type some of your reflections and we'll share those out to the broader community. So we're gonna put folks, I think, into groups of 4 and have fun. Folks are coming back into the room, so we just want to welcome everyone back into the big group. And if you are so inspired, please add some suggestions into the chat box based on your conversations. So maybe a habit that you've adopted that's maybe new since sort of probably spending a little bit more time at home in the past year that you've adopted and you want to share, or a resource like a podcast or an article or even a documentary that you've seen lately. Or maybe just a wish you have about the future of sustainability and waste. It's fun to compile these resources. We'll maybe read some out in a moment, and then also we can compile these into a list to send out to folks as well. I was saying to my staff that pretty much every day I annoy my teammates with a recommendation for a podcast. And just last week on How to Save a Planet, which is hosted by Alex Bloomberg, who you probably recognize his voice from many podcasts, and Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who focuses on ocean research, but they have a great podcast about climate change and science, and their most recent episode was on recycling. So I recommend that podcast, and I'll type that in too. But some of the suggestions coming in: reusable utensils, absolutely. I was just talking to the recycling director at the city of Cambridge yesterday and just talking about how there's just some elements to our system where I think we can just kind of swap them out. It's much, it's just pure waste sometimes when you get those utensils from takeout and you don't even take it out of the plastic wrap, they go straight into the trash. So there's areas like that where reusable utensils are just kind of a slam dunk. I hear another recommendation for How to Save a Planet. Jeremy Gregory said Jinx. Oh, maybe that's.
I put in the chat the link of the podcast you were talking about. So that was the Jinx. So.
I got it.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we're all probably in our parallel universes listening to the same things. Thank you, Jeremy. When ordering, try to order several items for delivery and not one at a time to save on packaging. So that darn Amazon, right? Like, it's so tempting to just kind of order one by one, but doing bulk orders when you can, both in the office and at home, is a great way to save. Collecting via a TerraCycle box, all of the non-rigid plastic for recycling. So yeah, there are specialty collections for things that are not hard plastic. NPR Throughline, a litter myth. Oh, great. So many great things. Lots of podcasts. Someone mentioned plastic film is being collected in a dorm, and I have a question about this program. So keep the questions going. Again, we have Ruth on the line too, so we can make sure, if not in the chat, then afterwards, we have a great FAQ that's halfway done that we're going to be sending out to all the participants. But yeah, thank you so much for connecting with each other. We've got a lot of yes, I love that podcast. Convince my dad to freeze chicken portions in Tupperware rather than plastic baggies. All right, reusables. So thank you for sharing. We hope you got to know maybe one or two people across campus that unfortunately we don't get to see every day since we're kind of scattered. And we'll again compile these into our takeaways. So I'll hand it back to Brian, and we are gonna lift off into parts 2 and 3 combined of our Waste IAP with us.
Yeah, you could just say, Susie, we're ready to dive in, maybe dive into the dumpster.
Dive in.
Yep, dumpster diving. So thanks everybody for your input. These are all fantastic tips, and I wrote a few down, especially around the reusability. So clearly, whether you joined us for the first session or you're new today, you all are thinking in the mindset of talking trash. And our role as the Office of Sustainability, working with partners such as the Department of Facilities and other academic groups on campus, research scientists on campus, working with all of you, our collective goal is, Nicole, could you advance the slide, please? Our collective goal is we want to drive more positive human and environmental impacts out in the world. And how can we do this as a system? So many of the suggestions many of you put in the chat, these are fantastic individual actions that are really important. How do we start to scale up those individual actions and strengthen the systems of MIT, both through what we buy, through how we use and reuse, and then how we dispose. So how do we scale up those individual actions at a dorm or an office scale, bring them campus-wide, and utilize all the efforts of MIT to tackle these waste challenges? Our overall framework is, how do we start to change the flow from a more linear flow of goods are consumed, they're used, and then we waste them, to a more circular flow where we are consuming goods that have a lot of recycled content in them. We're reusing materials multiple times. We will probably still have waste, but how is that waste at least being kind of rechanneled to feed the inputs again? Or how is that waste being captured to regenerate natural systems? So a term we use is, how do we design out waste from the system? If we have less waste coming in, we have less waste going out. These questions around system design, individual, kind of how do we empower individuals to order differently or order more sustainably through MIT's purchasing systems? How do we partner with our vendors? These are all the questions this series has asked, and we'll help raise more questions today and perhaps answer some more of those questions today. But this is a long-term game over many years, and we invite you all to be part of that process. The next slide, Nicole. So this is a review of what we looked at in the first session. A very simple kind of wheel that is summarizing the fact that a waste system requires infrastructure to collect the material, the handling of that cardboard or coffee cup. Someone then has to take all that cardboard and coffee cups and the trash and the cardboard. It has to get hauled somewhere. And then there's data generated about that process. And in the first session, we met the people who were involved in each of these steps along the way of the MIT campus. And we talked about the system itself. Today, we're going to look at the very same system, and we're now going to take another look at the infrastructure and say, well, how are we now, knowing what we know about the system, how are we now designing waste out of the system by integrating different kinds of infrastructure, by thinking about the handling differently, by looking at our hauling practices, by communicating differently, and particularly what we're going to cover a lot of today is, how are we collecting data about all of these processes and then using that data to drive more impactful decision making? So we'll be looking at the same waste system we all learned about last time, and now we're looking at how are we exploring evolving the four components of this system to design out waste from MIT over the next few years. Next slide, Nicole. Thank you. And so this first session today is, we have two parts. We're first going to spend time meeting with all these people listed here. Some have already been seen in the first session. We're going to focus on the data aspects of this whole system, because data-driven decision-making, data-driven analysis, data is critical to science, and that's the core of MIT, of our community. We need data in order to understand, where do we prioritize designing out waste? Do we tackle getting rid of coffee cups, or do we tackle trying to recapture more food waste? How do we weigh these things? It takes data to be able to begin to answer those research questions and then apply and develop the solutions. So we're going to learn today how we're beginning to build a data-driven platform looking at waste. And you'll, just like in the first session, you're going to meet some of the people who are part of our MIT community who are part of this process. We have Stu, who's from the Office of Sustainability, Ross, who's from our partner, RTS, they're our waste hauler. We have some absolutely incredible students, Suki and Amelia, who we'll hear from, Nicole, who you've met from the Office of Sustainability, and then Jeremy, who is a research scientist on campus. Each presenter will have about 5 minutes, and then we will wrap up with some questions and answers. We invite you to, during the session, continue to post your questions in the chat. We'll pull them, try to answer them as we go, or answer them in the chat. And then at the end of the session, we'll kind of close the book on MIT's waste and then zoom out and invite David from RTS to talk more broadly about the waste context. And that will get into a lot of the national sword policy and the international context. So with that, I'm going to introduce Stu Eiler. He's from the Office of Sustainability. He's a data scientist, and he'll talk through the platform that Stu and team are building around data, sustainability, and waste. Stu.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So hi, everyone. I'm Stu. As Brian said, I'm the data scientist with the Office of Sustainability. And today I wanted to chat for a few minutes about the Mitos approach to data, and then also to highlight a few of the waste-related data resources that we have for the MIT community. So if Nicole, you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So first, why is data relevant? And from our perspective, data and metrics help us to do a number of things, including quantifying and benchmarking our environmental and other impacts. They help us to evaluate the success of solutions. And this includes looking back at programs that we've implemented in the past to see how those programs are doing. They help us to use the campus as a living laboratory, and they help us to engage with students, faculty, and staff around the sustainability work that we're doing. And as it says here, taking all these together, really it helps us to make better sustainability related decisions. And part of the way I like to think about this is data can be used as a navigational tool. In a sense, it can help us to determine where we are now. It can help us to pinpoint where we want to go and maybe set out some goals. And then by understanding the campus system using data, we can chart a course between where we are and where we want to move towards. And so if you could go to the next slide, Nicole, just to briefly touch on the data that we use and then how the data we have and then how we use those data. So first, we have data covering topics from water to energy to transportation to waste. In the waste context, these include operational data, like the amount of trash and recycling coming out of the campus system over a given period of time, but also things like waste audit data, which allow us to look at the details inside of our waste streams to be able to see what's in there. And so we get these data from a variety of sources in different forms and formats, and we take them and we collect them together. We try to organize them and do some quality control. And then we use them for a combination of different purposes. Part of it that we use them for is to provide the data back to the MIT community for research and teaching. This allows people, if they want, to dive in more detail and conduct research and analyses of their own. We also create interactive visualizations for exploration and engagement. This allows people to see what trends there are for them to be able to explore the data. And for us, it provides a way to say, this is where we are, where we've come and where we want to go. And then lastly, we also use the data to perform analyses to inform decision-making. And as I mentioned before, sometimes this is looking back at past programs and saying, how did we do? How did this program work? And what can we do better moving forward? And so now I can highlight just briefly a couple of the data resources we have. If you could go to the next slide, Nicole. And so first, I'll just mention that we have a data website called the Sustainability Data Pool, and the URL is there at the top. And this site is dedicated to sustainability data and visualizations. And so I'll highlight just a couple of visualizations that we have on there related to waste. And so the first is this material matters dashboard. And as you can see, this shows amounts of materials collected from the campus over the 10-year period between 2009 and 2019. And these data are available on the site for download, including details on the different waste streams, and they're at a monthly frequency. And these have been really helpful in establishing a baseline for us, but they are at the campus-wide level. And so part of what we're looking to do moving into the future is to get these at a more detailed and granular level to really make the data more actionable so we really can move forward, as Brian was discussing, in designing out waste. And I know we'll talk more about that later today. And so if you could go to the next slide, Nicole, I just wanted to finally highlight this campus waste audits dashboard, also available on the data pool. And this was designed originally by one of our student fellows, Vivian Song. And it highlights, as it says, a number of waste audits that have been done in the past, looking at what's in these waste streams. And the slide here is showing some of the results from a waste audit that happened last year at the School of Architecture and Planning. And the main idea here is that out of almost 200 recycling bins, the students who were looking at these found that about 2/3 of them contained items that shouldn't be in the recycling. And you can see in the figure that this included things like coffee cups and used napkins. And again, like the previous dashboard, this really is providing a baseline for us to look back. And as we move forward, we're looking forward to continuing to build on this, and we'll hear more today how these data are being used. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you all. And we invite you to check out the data pool, and please reach out to us with any questions or comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for showing us the data platform and the data resources available today to the MIT community. Now I'd like to introduce Ross Guberman. Ross is from MIT's waste hauling partner called RTS. And RTS is both a waste hauler, and they also are helping us design out waste from the campus. So Ross, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. So my name is Ross Guberman. My role at RTS is Senior Vice President of Sustainability. And I have the pleasure of working with the Office of Sustainability and with Ruth and the Office of Recycling that we heard from in session 1. Having hands in both sides is fascinating and really helps drive, using that data, decisions as we look at designing out waste and then understanding what we can't design out. Well, how do we manage it and like bring it to different facilities to extract that value? So we can go to the next slide. So one thing I did want to touch on is kind of looking at waste instead of considering it a waste as its materials. So on the last slide we saw from Stu, that waste audit showed materials instead of waste. And some of the challenge is how do you collect that data and how do you present it? So this is an example of a different dashboard. So we're looking at the same data, but now we're looking at it different ways. So one challenge we have is being able to articulate the same data and be able to start talking about apples to apples. So we're working on how do we create methodology to be able to collect that data and present it so that when MIT has their dashboard or RTS has their dashboard or anyone has a dashboard, we start seeing the same kind of data and talking about it in the same way, like you would expect with energy. If someone started reporting energy in some way outside of kilowatts, you would have no idea what they're talking about. So we're trying to create some sort of like standardization around data around these material streams, which is a challenge because there really is no standardization yet. But I want to highlight sort of the ways that RTS works with MIT to collect data and articulate data. And we kind of have 3 different ways we do that. So we can go to the next slide. One is through technology. This is after it's been purchased, brought on campus, consumed. Now you have decided you no longer have value for that material and you put it into a trash bin, recycling bin, organics bin. So now it's in the bag and now it's going out into the equipment and we're collecting it through our trucks. We're able to measure that through a few different tech ways. We have sonar or camera sensors that we can put onto equipment that actually tells you the volume of a container. We have scales on the trucks that are actually picking up the different waste streams. So they're telling us the weight of the streams. And we have monitors in compactors that are telling us the fullness of those compactors to help manage that service. So those are like 3 data streams we're collecting from the actual waste removal side of it. So those come in, so we get volume, we get weights. They come in different ways and forms. So we can have to feed our dashboard in a variety of ways. We go to the next slide. And then there's the qualitative data stream. We did research in the fall of 2020, doing interviews with about 15 different people, undergrad, grad students, some staff, to understand the behaviors of how do people interact with the waste environment at MIT. So this is qualitative data. This really tells us, well, what are people actually doing? Or what do they say they're doing? Because there's a big difference between what you say and think you do versus what you actually do. So these are some findings from that. Two big takeaways, which is probably not a surprise to anyone on here, is data really matters at MIT. MIT makes decisions off data. And another takeaway is the transparency of that data, having trust and faith in that data. So we go to the next slide. Oh, just one more back. And these are kind of three encouraged ways to continue this engagement. Feel free in the chat if one of these stands out to you as a way that you feel really speaks to you in terms of coming into the spring 2021 or fall 2021 of how you might see yourself responding to different engagement programs through MIT. And then the last way we collect data, we'll go to the next slide, please. Next way we collect data, which is really understanding the actual behaviors, is through waste audits. And this is where we start getting into that material understanding. So now you can see the actual food, the single-use utensils that were brought up, the contaminated recycling. And that's where we're able to really now start getting understanding of what's actually going out in the trash stream, the recycling stream, organic stream, and see those materials. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see, and now the trash isn't really trash. Trash is all these different materials, and all these materials have values, and we can make different program decisions and using this data to really drive, how do we design out waste? How do we look at procurement? How do we implement different systems to see these materials, capture these materials, and continue the circularity of their value rather than linear and just dumping them into a landfill or incinerating them. So with that, I will pass it on.
Great. Thanks, Ross. We now have the fun of really hearing from the students and how they have been so deep in this work. So proud to introduce Amulya and Suki, who will represent Waste Watchers and the Undergraduate Association on Sustainability. I think that's UA Sustain. So Amulya and Suki, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. My name is Suki, and along with my partners, Amulya and Natalie, we are the student leaders of MIT Waste Watchers. Waste Watchers is a student organization that works under the MIT Office of Recycling and Materials Management with Ruth Davis. And we work to educate the MIT community on proper waste disposal practices and to sort of innovate and improve on existing waste infrastructures on campus. Next slide, please. In terms of strategy, we are big proponents of on-the-ground work through people interaction at events and target signages, which we spoke about a lot during our previous IAP workshop. During the virtual semesters, we shifted our focus to more campaigns and policy work to continue our efforts, even online, and we'll focus on that today. So to expand our policy efforts on campus this summer, Waste Watchers actually partnered with the Undergrad Association, the Sustainability Committee, and formed the first ever campus-wide Student Sustainability Coalition, which is just a collection of most, if not all, of the sustainability-focused student organizations on campus. And along with this big group, we strive to sort of drive policy and procurement at the administration level for the fall semester and the spring semester. And now I'm going to actually pass it off to my partner, Amulya, to talk about a specific pilot that we ran during the fall semester that was very successful.
Thank you, Suki. Next slide, please. So this fall, Waste Watchers worked very closely with Megan from UA Sustain to run a reusable utensil pilot with the help of Student Sustainability Coalition, or SSC, as Suki mentioned, RTS, MIT Dining, Division of Student Life, and more. And today we're going to explore a brief case study of our efforts. Next slide, please. So our motivation really began last summer when, as Suki mentioned, the SSC was formed. So joining forces with all of these different sustainability groups on campus, we tried to brainstorm ways to tackle one of the most pressing issues we foresaw in the fall 2020 semester, a monumental increase in waste and a significant shift to disposable materials in dining. Next slide, please. So our approach was essentially three-pronged. We had a reusable utensil pilot and a life cycle analysis, which was conducted by MIT students, Arnav Patel and Sheila Kennedy Moore, on different dining materials. And lastly, a waste audit conducted by RTS that was mentioned earlier in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the first part of our approach was the reusable utensil pilot, which ran from October 2020 until the end of the semester. This pilot supplied 230 interested students living on campus with a set of reusable wheat straw plastic utensils. We also conducted pre and post surveys of participants to gain insights into their preferences and suggestions as we aim to expand the pilot and reusable utensils into the spring semester. And on the slide, we see two different diagrams. So the first one, these are both from the post-pilot survey taken by participants. So we see from the first diagram that most participants are very likely to continue using their reusable utensils, which points to the longevity of the program. Additionally, we see that students actually prefer metal over wheat straw plastic utensils, which was taken into account in our recommendations to MIT Dining. Next slide, please. So to supplement our reusable utensil pilot and inform our recommendations to MIT Dining for the spring semester, we partnered with MIT students, as I mentioned earlier, Arnav and Sheila, who conducted a life cycle analysis of different dining materials in MIT class 2S885, which is just exploring sustainability at different scales. So this essentially involved analyzing materials for dining items, including utensils, containers, cups, and incorporating emissions from raw materials, production, usage, and disposal. So by combining Arnav and Sheila's recommendations with our own feedback from the reusable utensil pilot, we were able to make some informed and supported recommendations that not only incorporated student feedback, but also which materials resulted in the greatest decrease in energy use and emissions. Next slide, please. So to further evaluate, I guess, the situation of waste on campus during the fall semester, RTS developed a waste audit methodology and conducted 2 audits in Massey and Baker, which are both undergraduate residence halls. So this standardized methodology will be adopted by waste watchers in the spring semester and have students conduct these audits across campus to kind of have an idea of a comparison point between the fall semester when approximately 30% of students living on campus were provided with reusable utensils, and whereas in the spring semester, all on-campus undergraduates will be provided with these reusable utensils. Next slide, please. So kind of going off of that, we are, as part of our results, we have a combination of a campaign, a pilot, combined with data-driven statistics and understanding of our initiatives to send a comprehensive list of recommendations and suggestions to MIT Dining for the spring semester. And with this, we are excited to say that MIT Dining has worked with us to provide all undergraduates returning to campus in the spring semester, which is 3 classes, with a set of reusable stainless steel utensils and a guide to waste and sustainability on campus. And we're excited to explore how this impacts waste on campus, like I mentioned earlier, through waste audits and additional data-driven techniques. Now I'll pass it back to Suki to talk a little bit more about some future steps.
Thank you, Amelia. So definitely after seeing the success that we had during the fall semester, we definitely want to continue and expand the efforts that we have been doing, just as Waste Watchers and along with SSC and UA Sustain. So definitely first, we want to collect more data. We want to be able to run more regular waste audits with the RTS methodology to collect continuous MIT waste data. So there's more baseline in the future for other organizations, for our organization to continue forward. The second thing is we want to work with other student organizations and MIT offices to drive policy and infrastructure change for waste. And third, we want to continue our education efforts to put out data-driven waste infographics to educate the MIT community. Because definitely with all the data that we have been collecting, this is something that MIT students, I can speak myself, that will definitely want to hear and would definitely motivate them more to engage in. And if you are interested in joining in on these efforts and to drive your own initiatives, please feel free to reach out to Waste Watchers or SSC. The emails are right on the bottom. And we're really excited to see what the spring semester and beyond will hold. Thank you.
Thank you, Suki and Amelia. I can't take the time today to explain how impressive it is, the work you're all doing and how well you've integrated all of this data. It's a phenomenal case study and example. So thank you for sharing it. And we look forward to working with you going forward. Maybe someone, if you can put those emails into the chat as well, if anyone wants to connect with you directly. So thank you. Now I'm pleased to introduce Nicole Morell, who's from the Office of Sustainability. She's our communication specialist, and communication is critical to this work. Nicole.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, everyone's been talking about different ways data drives kind of the responses we do as far as the waste room on campus. And I'm going to highlight some ways that data is driving our communications and outreach efforts on campus, specifically through signage. So if you joined us at our last session, you heard from our partners at Recycle Across America, who are working to standardize waste signage in order to design out waste across the country and at places like MIT as we explore this new partnership. We learned that their overall sign design and layout is data-driven by their ongoing research. But what we didn't dive into last time is that it also relies on the expertise of each organization to really make those signs functional. So this is done through making informed decisions through quantitative and qualitative data around what items to call out on signs for maximum impact, which means highlighting examples of what should and shouldn't go in a bin. So you can see on the right-hand side a mock-up of in language what shouldn't go in, and then in images what should. So these do's and don'ts are where data from campus actually comes in. So even though waste and recycling around MIT are collected through a unified approach, as we learned in the first session, what enters into buildings across campus and has the potential to become trash or recycling really varies. And what's likely to contaminate a recycling stream in an academic building is different from what might do so in a dorm. And that's where our campus waste audits come in that you've seen referenced already, some of which were conducted by our friends at Waste Watchers that just shared. Through these, which are ongoing and have been conducted in a number of spaces at MIT, we can look to see what it is that comes into offices and lounge spaces that maybe should be called out on signs in offices and lounge spaces, for example. And we were able to look at our data for that and understand that our biggest challenge there for waste stream and recycle stream contamination is actually disposable coffee cups. So that's something we made sure will be on signage in those spaces. And you can also see right here, these are an example of signs that will soon be what residents see in the new E37, which is graduate housing. So again, going back to the fact that some buildings require us to refine our messaging and signage even more. So for example, all dorms are not the same. You wouldn't expect infant diapers to be a waste stream issue in an undergraduate dorm, but in a graduate dorm, these are unfortunately a common contaminant. So under the advisement of Ruth Davis, who you heard from last time, who is our recycling guru, we work to ensure that diapers are actually something that's called out on the as a don't on the new graduate housing signage. And then last, another good example of different types of building data that's driving these different choices for signage is something like foam packaging, which is a no-no for recycling. But for a lounge or office, foam packaging might look like take the form of a takeout container. But for a dorm, foam packaging may take the form of something that comes with your online shopping order. So making sure that the right images are reflected in the right spaces is really important. And just one final note is that we've designed these signs for the data to change. We don't look at the data, etch it in stone and move on. We've crafted the signage and chose the items to feature, knowing that we'll keep tracking the data of what's in the waste stream, what's in the recycling stream, and adjust our signs accordingly. So just a little tidbit to think about the next time you see waste signs around campus, and think about all the thought that actually goes into what appears on those signs. And I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thanks, Nicole, for reminding everybody that these signs, they are thoughtful signs. There'll still be criticism, but we welcome your critical feedback and input. It's a system that's continually evolving. So thank you, Nicole. And now to round out this session on data, we have Jeremy Gregory, a research scientist at MIT, who is a fellow trash talker. Jeremy, take it away.
Great. I'm always glad to talk about trash here. And in particular, what's why is it important to do research in this space as well? There's a lot of things we know, but research is for the things that we don't know. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research we do for data-driven decision-making. Next, please. And in particular, 3 different topic areas. One is about tracking GHG emissions associated with MIT's waste management. Another is evaluating environmental impacts of procurement and recycling strategies. And the third one is evaluating the effectiveness of different interventions we can do to improve waste management. So on the next slide, you'll see the first one, which is basically an effort we have to track greenhouse gas emissions associated with MIT's waste as part of our efforts to track emissions on campus. The black bars are associated with the left axis, which is annual waste collection. And the green bars are associated with the GHG emissions on the right there. And what you can see with that number in the upper right is that actually we have a net negative GHG emissions associated with our waste practices right now. And that's a lot of that is because of credits that we get for recycling, which are mostly about recycling cardboard and aluminum. But you can see what we're trying to do is track these things, and then in particular, see how we're doing over time, and then see how that fits into other GHG emissions tracking that we're doing. On the next slide, you can see a project that we did that was kind of similar to what we heard about from the LCA earlier from the Waste Watchers. This was specifically about disposable gloves and what are some different treatment strategies associated with that. This here is showing basically where we looked at both burdens and benefits associated with those 4 different strategies you see along the bottom: waste to energy, sending gloves basically for incineration, that's waste to energy, landfill, or recycling when it can be used again as rubber, or recycling when it's used as a filler. And what you can see, those dots show the net numbers, and it's a pretty significant variation. But this is an example of how we're trying to quantify, what is the right thing to do from an environmental standpoint. On the next slide, you can see I'm working with several people across campus now trying to apply that same lens to PPE, which, as you can imagine, our usage on campus is going up quite a bit. It turns out that, a lot of this stuff is difficult to recycle or not economically feasible. So actually what we're trying to do from a waste perspective is say, how can we be the most efficient with how much that we buy? It turns out when we first started the pandemic, we weren't really coordinating how much we had on campus. And so kind of like toilet paper and other things, we were sort of overbuying many things. And that meant, frankly, we're just not being very efficient. So we're trying to, kind of like Brian talks about, design out waste. This is actually one of the ways you can do that is through effective procurement of the right amount. So that's a great project I'm doing with many other people. And the last topic on the next slide is about how do we really inform decisions based on what kinds of interventions we want to use to improve waste management. So there are many ideas that people have about, should we use better signage? And right here, I just have a couple examples of different, kinds of signage that have been proposed. You can see the one on the left is like super busy. The one on the right is kind of abstract. There are all kinds of different ideas that we've had. What we've done is propose some approaches where we leverage insights from behavioral science, and have worked with some researchers on campus, including Reusable, to test the effectiveness of different strategies through randomized controlled trials to be able to say really what works and what doesn't. And so I think that's something that we'll do. The great thing is we can collaborate with the Waste Watchers to help us collect that data and then analyze it as well. So lots of different opportunities there. So that's it from me on the research side.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And thanks to all the presenters. It's really hard to present a lot of material in a short period of time, and you all kept to the time, and that leaves us now with a few minutes for questions. So I invite you to post some questions in the chat. We'll get to whatever we can today. Jeremy, one of the questions coming through is, what are these GHG credits? Does MIT get a credit for the recycling? Is this a Massachusetts state thing? What do you mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's no like formal greenhouse gas system that MIT is part of. Like you might hear about markets like that they have in California for certain types of emitters, and even New England is part of a regional system. That doesn't involve MIT specifically, but MIT still tracks greenhouse gas emissions. We've been reporting what we call our scope 1 and 2, which are direct emissions from campus. and indirect emissions associated with electricity for many years. What we're doing now is tracking what we call scope 3, all other kinds of emissions, and many folks in the Office of Sustainability are involved in that effort, including Brian and Stu, who are on here, and Alex Canepa as well is helping us with reporting that information to the data pool. So, but what I showed is basically our own method for accounting for that. And that's just the credits that were shown there are sort of the conventional approach used for greenhouse gas accounting that we were following, actually the numbers that were published by the EPA. So it's not like we're formally part of a trading system. That's just part of the conventional way to be able to quantify those.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. And Suki and Amolya, we'll put this question your way. Perhaps in a return to somewhat of a normal campus, when departments and labs and centers are functioning, one of the questions coming through is, well, how can departments, labs, and centers be supportive and engage in these efforts? And here's an opportunity perhaps for Waste Watchers to give a quick pitch.
Yeah. I guess I can take the first and then you can continue, Suki. I think, yeah, until now, our efforts, I guess, especially with this remote semester, have been really targeted towards undergraduates and residence halls. But definitely as we things open back up, there's definitely going to be issues in departments and labs and different areas. So I think off the top of my head, kind of expanding our current methodologies, with signages and campaigns, but working with different MIT offices that do not only, I guess, target undergraduates, but maybe working with the graduate sustainability group. They are part of the Student Sustainability Coalition, so it would be easy to reach out to them, but kind of working together and trying to use our current undergraduate efforts and kind of translate them into higher levels. But Suki, do you want to add stuff to that?
Yeah, so I think that one of the far-reaching primary goals that Waste Watchers always wanted to accomplish was to mandate that all students coming onto campus have a mandatory waste education where they learn where exactly things go. And along the way, what we have been doing is reaching out to different departments or offices to try to spread this information down to the students within their own department. So I think that definitely working with department heads, working with the different research labs to be able to put out this kind of messaging about what goes where, and especially for Waste Watchers to sort of curate them so that it fits into the lab or research lab environment where we see what specific waste is produced. That way we can make sure that every student in these departments and every faculty can also know where exactly things go, because this kind of information, even though it's out there, is pretty hard to find. So we want to make sure it's accessible to them at all times.
Thanks, Suki and Amolya. I think, yeah, just to close on that, Waste Watchers peer-to-peer model is really effective of students teaching other students and students working with staff to help teach good behavior. So it's a wonderful model. And for those interested as a department, contact Waste Watchers and they can explore how best to work with you. I want to be mindful of the time. We've got some great questions coming in and some answers as well in the chat. So we're going to capture those questions and answers and make sure to share that back out with you. At this point, I think I'm going to hand over to, is it Nicole or Susie? I think we want to wrap up this panel and then move on to the next.
Yep. So we're going to give folks about 5 minutes to stretch their legs, grab a glass of water. Please come back. We are so excited to, as Brian mentioned, now that we've been thinking a lot about the campus, we realize the campus fits into a much larger context. And so we're excited to zoom out and learn more there. And then we'll come back together at the end and do a little bit of a creative debrief. So take 5 minutes. You can turn off your video and you can mute yourself and just maybe wiggle around, stretch your legs, get some water. And we posted some of the answers to the questions that came in when you registered here. And like we said, we'll be emailing the broader FAQs out to folks too. So we'll come back at 2:05. We are right on time. And thank you all for joining part 2 of 3. Part 3 of 3 coming up at 2:05.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for those who had a few questions on the questions that we posed here on the slide. In the chat, perhaps we can get some of these answered. Ruth, I do see there's some questions about the black plastic. I don't know if you happen to know the answer. Maybe you're able to chat, and we'll try to grab these questions as well and include them in a listing of questions that we'll share.
Yes.
So great. So thanks for the questions, and Ruth will try to answer some in the chat, and we can go forth. Nicole, can you share the next slide? Thank you, Nicole. So for those who have stuck around, which is our whole crew, this is wonderful. We know people with waste are very serious, and we're glad you stayed with us. So far in this session and the first session, we've learned about the waste collection system at MIT. We've learned about approaches of collecting additional data about waste, and we've seen some fantastic examples of how that data is now helping to lead to further efforts to design out waste. It's a very iterative cycle here that's continuing to evolve. We've seen examples of how we're leveraging the campus as a test bed for developing solutions to design out waste on campus, but clearly some of those solutions can also start to be applied elsewhere. And we can apply solutions from elsewhere to campus. So now we invite David Segal from RTS. RTS is our waste hauler and also a sustainability partner in helping us design out waste. And David is knowledgeable about the world beyond MIT when it comes to waste. And so he's going to set us a broader context now that fits the campus context that we've used as our case into this broader context. And I imagine there is a lot of alignment, and hopefully by the end of David's walkthrough, we'll all have an understanding of how efforts on campus can help solve challenges more globally, and how those global challenges can help inform some of our solutions testing on campus. We'll have some time at the end for some questions, so we continue to invite you to put your questions into the chat. We'll collect them at the end of David's talk, and then he'll have some time to answer them. So David, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Can you guys hear me all right? All right, great.
We can.
Thank you again. And I just want to reiterate something that I know we had spoken about, which is just, it's so great to see all the work that's being done here by UA Sustain, Waste Watchers, all of the sustainability folks, your office. And I know some of the work that Ross and team have been able to do with MIT. You know, as I shared before, you know, we wish that we had these types of sessions with all of our customers and all of our partners. And we're getting there. We're getting to a place where that's the case, but it's as you can imagine, this is extraordinary, and you guys are thinking about things that very few other people think about. So I really appreciate that. As Brian said, I wanted to just broaden the picture, and there have been, I know, over the last 3 sessions, including today, there have been a lot of questions, I think, in the margin on the chat box, but also in general about, you know, broader questions, as Brian said, outside of the campus. Or, you know, is it true that what we recycle is not getting recycled? You know, we've heard that a lot. I want to start addressing some of that to put what's been said in sort of a broader political and economic context, because everything that the challenges that you're facing at MIT exactly mirror the challenges that we're facing more broadly in society. You're just probably handling them better. But as you go out into society, we're going to need you all to help solve for it. So if we could move to the next slide, please. And yeah, the next one, please. So in the previous one, actually, I titled this recycling as a commodities market, intentionally, perhaps provocatively, because I think that, you know, we're socialized from such a young age, at least since the 90s here in the US, to think that that recycling is a service that is provided and it's sort of out of sight and out of mind. And once you toss that, you know, item into the blue bin or the relevant colored bin, it will get recycled. And we've touched on, danced around, talked about the fact that is not always the case. And there's a simple reason for it, and it's perhaps a sad reason. There's a history behind, political history behind it, but the true reason is that recyclables, items that are recycled, which are two different things, of course, but items that even stand a chance of getting recycled have to be bought by somebody. The recycler has to purchase it. That recycler could be a middle person, a middle group, could be the eventual producer of a new product they would create from that material. But somebody has to buy it. And that's something that's really not well understood. So I started this, I started with an intentionally kind of simple looking picture here. And I might not, and this is probably semantic, but I might contradict in the quiz that we had at the beginning. I think that the question about, one of the questions on what's recyclable, I think that this question is often confused with another question, which is what actually gets recycled. Most things, most items, I can't say, so technically you're correct, not everything that has arrows on it can be recycled, but most can with proper investment, right? There's some place in the world and somebody and some optical sorter or something that can do it for the vast majority of these things. Or there's a composting method, it just takes longer, or it's more expensive, or there's more labor, but it doesn't get done. And so there is a huge difference between what is recyclable and what actually gets recycled. And then it gets even hairier because it's not uniform across jurisdictions anywhere in the United States. So every town, every city, every university within a city, well, universities are a bit different depending if you're a public or private university, but the answer to the question when you ask a waste hauler traditionally or a material recovery facility, which is where the recyclables should go, when you ask them, they'll answer numbers 1, 2, 5, and 6 or something like that. That doesn't mean that 3, 4, 7, and 8 are not scientifically recyclable. It also doesn't mean that 1, 2, 5, and 6 are getting recycled. So it doesn't mean either of those two things. So I just want to highlight that because that's really the central premise of what I wanted to discuss here. Could we just move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So obviously this is the story we are told, and there's a great success behind this. I think, the rise of the recycling movement, over the course of many decades, but really in earnest in the early 90s. If you look at the data, there wasn't much recycling, again, in the sense of putting things into a recycle bin going on prior to the early 1990s. But things really took off since then and steadied out pretty quickly to a pretty high rate. A high rate meaning, again, that people put a lot of things in the bin, not that they get recycled, which we'll get into. But I think we're all familiar with this. We learned this in school, since the, anyone who went to school probably from the late 80s on learned this in school. Reduce, reuse, recycle, which continues to be the correct order. But the recycling process is not really well understood. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the real story is that recycling, as I said, recyclables, things that can be recycled, are really dependent on commodities markets. And so when you, excuse me 1 second, I'm sorry, I have my obnoxious Outlook making all sorts of crazy noises. I'll close that. The truth is that there has to be a buyer, as I said before. And that means that if there's not a real economy for a certain item, it likely won't get recycled. So I'll just stop there on this slide because you can see, something interesting here on paper commodity prices, which is something we're going to get into, which is that as of 2018 or so, early 2018, the commodity value of most recyclables took a nosedive in response to, mostly in response to something called Operation National Sword, which was a policy implemented by the government of China that effectively eliminated the possibility of exporting recyclables to China as an initial buyer. In practice, it's still allowed for China to import certain products, but the contamination rate at which they could import it was so low that it essentially made it not feasible for a lot of products. So let's move to the next slide. Okay. So the real result, and I should here have put that those arrows at the bottom actually represent the words, this can end up at this point as trash at any of these points. And it's important, you know, when you put something in the bin, it may never actually even stand a chance of recycling, because if a hauler is irresponsible, they may mix it with trash, and that's illegal in most places, but, or in most places, but they may mix it and so not even give it a shot of getting recycled. They may deliver it to the material recovery facility, but that material recovery facility, even though they say we accept 1, 2, 5, and 6, or 1, 5, and 6, or 1 and 2, they may at the moment not have a buyer, and they are not legally obligated to actually recycle it just because the county or the town says that it's recyclable, again, which is a huge policy disconnect. If something is recyclable according to a jurisdiction, to me, a material recovery facility should be either obligated to recycle it, or the jurisdiction should drop that demand because it's not doable. And I'm sympathetic, in a lot of ways, it is not doable for some items. If you can move to the next slide, please. So Operation National Sword, it's complicated, and we had a great, you know, we had a discussion preparing this lesson that I think is really important to highlight. You may have been asking, you know, when I spoke a slide or two ago, why are recyclables being exported to China in the first place? It's a great question, and for those, many of you may know, and there have been some interesting podcasts and articles in recent months and years since National Sword was instituted, that I think have educated a lot of people on this matter. But essentially, at some point in the 80s, some brilliant person, and I say brilliant in very much in quotes, decided that because the U.S. imports, because U.S. companies import so many products from China, mostly on barges that at that point that ended up on the West Coast, and send those barges back empty, that in order to maximize profit, they should send them back full. Well, what could US companies or US sellers send back to China? They're not going to buy products from the US because of pricing realities, at least at that time, that continue. So they did what I would say is probably the worst possible idea, and decided to see if there would be Chinese buyers for the recyclables. That would, of course, mean then that in this sort of unvirtuous cycle, the Chinese companies will be producing materials for consumption by people in the United States who are driving that demand, and so therefore driving the associated environmental costs. And then those same consumers are then shipping products back in order to ideally be repurposed for themselves. And that's an ideal situation. As you might imagine, that actually barely ever happened. So what did happen is that the basic tenets of the policy. So basically, from the 80s and 90s on, really the early 90s when recycling took off, a good half of what we recycle as Americans, or I should rephrase it, a good half of what even gets out of the material recovery facility at the end was ending up in China and Hong Kong, if you count the two as one political entity. That's a ton. I mean, that's a ton. It's a lot more than a ton. The basic tenets of China's operational national sword policy, which I believe was instituted at the beginning of 2018 officially, like I said, was essentially that we as a country, and so it was really a law created by the government to that would affect companies, that told Chinese-based companies or any entity or any individual that they can no longer accept materials that are contaminated beyond a certain amount. And that means that they're not pure. And nothing, and in the United States, even though people in the United States have gotten much better at putting more in the recycle bin, people here have never been particularly good about putting the right things in the recycle bin and putting things that can be recycled. And we've talked a lot about, you know, some of the things that, you know, the obvious ones that we now all know about, like plastic bags and things like that. But there are some much less obvious ones. And so this is not to blame, you know, to put the blame all on the person throwing things into the bin, but the contamination actually can affect whether or not it even gets accepted. and in the past, whether or not it even got recycled, which I'll get into in a bit. Why did this happen? Well, it happened in a political context, of course, in the past couple of years. It could have happened as part of the quote unquote trade war, that people have termed it that. There was an element of timing that would lead, I think, me to believe that part of the rationale was as retaliation for some tariffs that were imposed on Chinese goods by the previous administration. But really, it's also a matter of national pride, and I'm completely sympathetic. This is something else we talked about. I think that, in our industry, and I hope that our company is an outlier in terms of our focus on sustainability and technology, but it's very common, and I think Ross would probably echo me on this, to hear about operational national sort as a catastrophe for recycling. It was a catastrophe in a very surface level sense. At the end of the day, the policy was never really a good policy. It wasn't, because things were not actually getting recycled. So what you actually had happening was that the items that were being shipped to places like China wasn't the only country, but to places like China, had high contamination rates. So who's sorting through this material? Low paid workers, in some cases, child workers, workers not making a living wage, often in conditions that were toxic, that were physically toxic to them. And then in general, because they had no other option, often dumping most of what was unusable, which was most of what was sent, into the South China Sea via rivers or just right into the South China Sea. And so, it was sort of the consumer hunger on this side of the planet driving more negative environmental consequences on the buyer side there, the producer of our products and the buyer of our trash, really. And so it was not a good policy. So is it a catastrophe? It's a catastrophe in the proximate sense that the commodities have completely lost their value and in some cases gone negative. And what that means is that we can't even go through the motions of having a buyer and at least having a small percent of that recycled. But it's also an opportunity because it opens our eyes to something that was always the truth, which is that this is a terrible system. This is very much my opinion. I'm editorializing here. Other people may disagree with me. There are people in the industry that disagree because it's a hassle. But from an environmental perspective, I feel pretty strongly about that. The hardest hit, I think, have been the municipal markets, especially during COVID for obvious reasons. If we could go to the next slide, please. So you can see here that the actual effects of the national sort policy were tremendous. I don't even think these graphs are not, first of all, they're not to scale with one another, but they don't do it justice. I mean, you can see in 2017, how many millions of kilograms, I suppose that's the measure, were being of recyclable, so-called recyclables, were being shipped to China, and then you can see basically by the time of implementation what it went down to. What I think these graphs don't do justice to, this is from the Census Bureau, is what the consequences of that have been. So where is that recycling going now? That's the question a lot of you have been asking. Well, some of it is now going to countries like Senegal, Turkey, Bangladesh, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, although there's the Philippines, although there's been some interesting politics now around the Philippines instituting a similar ban on importing contaminated recyclables. But those, if you really look at those numbers, that's not really offsetting the full amount, right? And so where's the rest of it going? Well, to the point that a lot of you have been making, unfortunately, a lot of it is getting landfilled at the end of the day. Again, in some sense, that was always the case. If something was ending up in the South China Sea or getting landfilled in China, to me, it was getting landfilled. And so it was still a problem and still a problem now. But to some degree, the level of landfilling has increased, although not as, I would argue, not as dramatically as others would potentially say, because I don't think the rate was ever particularly high to begin with. So in terms of your bottle's destination, this is actually, this wording, I pulled this wording from the Guardian article and I purposely kept it the way they phrased it. I think I changed it a little bit so I don't have to quote it, but I wanted to highlight something here because this is also a major source of confusion, which is that the way that the Guardian article phrased it is that of the 9% of America's plastic that the EPA estimated was recycled in 2015, China and Hong Kong handled more than half. We really have to parse this apart. What's actually being said here is that in general, about 9% of all plastic used in the US, actually since, if we're really looking in the aggregate, since the 50s, but I guess by year they calculated it, actually got sort of sent for processing, for recycling. And that's a really obviously low number. Within that, China and Hong Kong handled. We don't actually know what happened to that 9%. And I should say, the numbers are higher for most other streams. We focus on plastic because it's the most depressing one. It's the hardest, in some ways, the hardest to recycle. Cheap virgin plastic is very cheap, and so there's traditionally not been a market for it. So the overall rate of what gets recycled is not quite that low, but for plastic it is. Can we please move to the next slide? So this is just reiterating what I think we've already discussed, which is that from the Chinese perspective, their plastics imports have plummeted by 99%. It's essentially eliminating an entire trade, an entire industry. And imports of mixed paper have dropped by a third. Again, in part, sellers of this commodity, like the United States, have adapted and figured out ways to sort it so that it wouldn't be as contaminated. But paper also tends to retain value because for scientific reasons, it can be repurposed a little bit more easily and cheaply. Can we just move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So, so this is this left graphic, I think, is really, for me, very powerful. Like I said, I once went to look, how much of plastic that has ever been made has actually been recycled. And if you look at it here, you'll see that it's about, well, it's very low. And you can see really what's happening here. So if the total virgin plastic that's produced is 8.3 billion tons, and this was as of 2015, so it's a couple of years, the stat is a couple of years old, but unfortunately the numbers haven't changed much. You can sort of see at each point along the way why it doesn't get recycled. And to mitigate some of the damage here, a lot of the virgin plastic from that aggregate period is actually still in use. So all is not lost. But when you look at the top blue slice, we're looking at what gets sort of used once, discarded, incinerated, and what actually gets recycled. To go back to National Sword, you can see here on the right that, I think it's pretty clear that that a plurality, if not an outright majority, it's pretty close, of plastic waste in particular. And this is not true of all streams, although China was a huge buyer of aluminum, remains so, and paper, was going to China and Hong Kong. And you can see even in the first half, I believe, of 2018, already the share to Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Taiwan, Indonesia, Turkey increased, in some places more dramatically than others, but of course not compensating for how much was previously shipped. And so again, there's more landfilling occurring on this side of the ocean. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what this means for markets, to my point, is that domestic markets have been overwhelmed with excess supply of potential recyclables. The increased supply has, of course, in turn reduced the value of the materials. And if you look across materials, it's happened basically across, this is just pre-COVID, because COVID, when you mix in the effects of COVID, it's hard to parse it out. But so I think this graph is a little more instructive, but you can see, you can see right here what has happened. And mixed paper has gone down the most, not just because it's actually gone the most, it's worth the least. It's actually because it was in some ways worth the second most, but had a big drop. I just want to be clear about that. In general, plastic tends to be worth the least of all of these things. Can we please go to the next slide? Thanks. So maybe I'll sort of wrap up here. I think that, for me, I think Ross is definitely a better authority than me for this, but one of the things that I always wonder is, is single stream recycling, is the fact that for the most part, and this is not true, for those of you who worked in an office, say, where you have a paper bin and then a bin for everything else, or if you've been to parts of Western Europe and other places in the world where they literally have 9 different colors of bins in the streets, or even on their house, even in some of their apartments and dwellings. This is not the case everywhere, but essentially the US's system is single stream, which means you put everything in the same bin. And of course that leads to, in addition to the contamination of people putting things that just can't be recycled, again, because of economic constraints, not necessarily scientifically, although that happens too. You also add the dimension of the necessity to sort this out, because the buyer doesn't want all of this. The buyer, whether that buyer is in China or in Boston, in Cambridge, down here in New York, in West Virginia, they want the purchase to be as seamless as possible. And it means they want it to be as pure as possible. And pure also means homogeneous. There are a variety of reasons, that's a whole other lesson. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to take that offline for why single stream became the main way of collection. It largely had to do with lobbying by the largest by the largest companies in particular sectors a couple of decades back. It's going to be hard to come out of it. I mean, maybe if we could go to the next slide, I think I have some potential solutions. But basically, as I mentioned also in our preparation call, I've been accused of being a huge bummer and finishing everything off on a negative note. I want to be clear that I actually really do view this as an opportunity. This is an inflection point, and particularly with the new administration, which likely will be more amenable to looking into this. The only way we were ever going to really solve the garbage and recycling problem, which are really one and the same to a large extent, was by ending the practice of shipping materials out of the country, in my opinion. So I think it's a good thing. However, we have no solution now for those products that are not being shipped out, short of what other country will take it. Or let's put it in a storage shed. I mean, we happen to work with, as you know, our hauling partner that services MIT is one of the original recycling pioneers. And if you go to his facility, you'll see that he stores materials that, that there's no technology to recycle yet, but like maybe in 2050. I mean, but that's unique, that barely exists. And so we need investments in domestic MRF, material recovery facility processing capacity. Right now, it's too expensive. That's largely due to wages, which is a good thing. People should be paid a fair wage in the US, but that means that we need optical sorters and scanners and forms of technology that are more advanced than what material recovery facilities usually have, which essentially is just gravity. They basically just pop things. If any of you have ever been to a MRF, they basically just pop items up and then sort of on the assumption that glass is heavier than aluminum, is heavier than paper, is heavier than plastic, or so, and they have like 5 different steps along the way, which can only clean it so much. So, another reason it's been so great to speak with you all is that, you guys have the scientific, a lot of you have the scientific expertise. I know not everyone focuses on scientific. It's obviously a false assumption, but a lot of you have the scientific expertise that's going to be the only way for us to get out of this problem. I do think it's highly possible. It just requires investment. None of these things are scientifically impossible. They can all be done. We just need to invest in it. And I think that I won't get into extended producer responsibility too much, which I support as a political concept, which sort of puts the producer of the product on the hook for the externality, the negative externality. It's controversial because they may just end up passing the price on to the consumer anyway, but it's a possibility. But I will just say that if you take anything from this, it's that material recovery facilities, even though they accept certain items, are not necessarily required to actually see the recycling process through. In fact, they really can't. As a hauler, the hauler often loses chain of custody. So we don't have the right, in certain cases, to ask a material recovery facility for an audit of themselves. So what from what we gave you did you actually end up recycling? We know the better players, so we try to work with them, but it really needs to be consolidated. There has to be a lot of serious policy changes, in my opinion, that would incent this type of behavior. So I'll just pause there. Sorry, I know I said a lot there, but I do believe that we're going to be heading in the right direction on this. It's just going to be, it's an immense challenge.
David, are you wrapped up? I think there's I think there was one or two more slides you had loaded.
Yeah, I think I'll wrap up there. I mean, those are the main points I wanted to make.
Fantastic.
I think the other two slides were like I had brought us back to the original question of what is recyclable, 1 through 8. And if anyone's interested, you can look up. It's fascinating. You'd be surprised the things that fit in the same category as one another. And then just sort of a provocative question, but I think we've addressed it, and I want to give time.
Well, David, fantastic. Thanks for really sort of opening up the conversation to the global markets. We can take about 5 minutes for questions. And boy, there were a few that came in. Some are getting answered, and let's try this one. David, I'll give you both questions together, and this may help you tie it together. So one of the questions is, well, given it sounds like you spoke quite a bit about some of the ultimate end markets internationally, the question is, well, are there any US-based mass recyclers, and could this market get kickstarted domestically rather than relying on these international buyers? That's the question for you to pick apart. And then Jeremy had a question, which I think kind of goes along with that, which is, well, if MIT approves the purity of our recycling streams, is there an increase in value that we could ultimately capture from our streams if we're sort of doing a better job without commingling all these streams? So can we as one entity start to benefit from that as it gets out to the mass recyclers? So maybe you can take both of those together.
Absolutely. So those are great. I had seen some questions in the margins, so I apologize. That's why I ended a little early too. I was hoping to take some of the questions, but I think to the second question first, there are two ways to look at it. I think one is are there opportunities for MIT to capitalize on it, whether that mean monetarily or reputation-wise, and that would be I think the answer is definitely yes. From a just an economic perspective, if you can actually produce material that's less contaminated and prove it and make a material recovery facility believe it, which very few entities, no matter how responsible they are, have been able to do, you will get cheaper MRF prices and therefore cheaper hauling prices, because the hauler will also pass on the savings in the bid to you. So there is a material incentive, and I try to I lead our efforts on towns and cities across the country, and I try to spread that word to towns and cities as well. Towns and cities are used to, the old model was that a hauler like us would come to, or I shouldn't say a hauler like us, a traditional hauler would come to the town and say, hey, this is our price for trash. We'll do recycling for free. Don't even worry about it. Because that hauler was getting a rebate. Not only were they not paying, but they were getting money from the material recovery facility, who in turn was getting money from a middleman that was getting money from a Chinese buyer. Because the market has completely collapsed, that dynamic no longer exists. And so haulers like us charge to recycle. We have to. In fact, we pay to actually, in some cases, sadly, we've crossed sort of the Rubicon whereby it's more expensive to drop off recyclables than trash for a hauler. And so there is an economic opportunity if you're able to separate that out, because you can get cheaper prices. In terms of if there's an opportunity for MIT to make a broader impact because you have a cleaner stream, yes, but only really through education. Because if you figured out a way to do that, I think that the best way to do the only way to spread that would be to explain to other people how to do it. It still remains the greatest challenge, and the place to start, in my mind, would be the city of Cambridge and the Boston metro area, which from a policy perspective are super committed to these things, but have high contamination rates. And so maybe there's an opportunity to partner with the city to get an education program going. And sorry, the first, can you remind me? Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, and Jeremy, did you have a clarification on there?
I think I'll just follow up. It basically, it's great to know that there are opportunities if you think really from an economic standpoint, because I think that's someone we can use to maybe motivate some people on campus. So, but we can follow up with that so we can get to some other questions here too.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, David, the other one, could you talk very briefly about the commodities consolidation process in the US? So the question was, are there mass recyclers in the US? And if you could explain that briefly.
Yeah, so they're sort of buyers and recycler, the actual recyclers. Yeah, there are big material recovery facilities here in the U.S. Mostly sort of clustered around large cities. And unfortunately, from an environmental justice perspective, something I didn't get to touch on, usually in areas that are socioeconomically disadvantaged because of zoning issues throughout history. So there are a number of the material recovery facilities. So in terms of capacity, I don't think that, I'm not so sure, and I probably have to look more into this. It's a really great question. I don't know that facility capacity is really the constraint. It's the lack of the technology in these facilities. It's just so, like New Mexico only has one MRF, but they only need one MRF. They just need a MRF that actually works, and it doesn't. So we have these facilities, we just don't have it. In terms of I actually want to add one thing to that. There has been, especially since Operation National Sword, a small popping up of a paper of a paper industry, repurposing industry here in the U.S. Interestingly, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs actually have started those facilities, which is great. And I think so. There is a domestic, in that sense, market for paper and cardboard, and as the Amazon economy becomes the economy, essentially. That's a bigger part of the game. Cardboard is still valuable, has some value. It goes up and down, but it still does have value. And so again, a lot of what I spoke about here in terms of the depressing stats is plastic related. A lot of cardboard and paper gets recycled. A lot of aluminum gets recycled. Glass is complicated because what recycling something made of sand means is complicated, but it goes through the process. Plastic, not so much. So I think if we could create I personally think that you'd need the government to intervene to create financial incentives the same way we do for solar and wind power on the plastic front to create a domestic market. I think on other fronts, we will start seeing people realizing, to I think the implication of your question, that there's an opportunity here. Shouldn't we just process it locally? We can do it.
Thanks, David. We'll take one more. I'll combine these two together, and I think the opportunity is the key word. So as there's a new administration, as there's new talk of investments in infrastructure, in quotes, does any of that kind of infrastructure talk include some of this technology around recycling markets, recycling facilities? And are there some models domestically in other nations that are doing this effectively in terms of this clean source separation that enables a cleaner output that the US could consider?
Definitely. They're great questions. And I think that from a policy perspective, the first part of that question is really what I'm considering now. Obviously, the new administration and new control of Congress opens up some new possibilities. Although, as I mentioned in the chat box, recycling has interestingly always been a bipartisan issue. Like whenever we have a national recycling plan, you get Congress to pass it like 413 to 0 to 2 with with a couple of abstentions. And then as soon as you tie it to climate change, it becomes, it's exactly down party lines, as we always see. So, but with recycling, there is a consensus. And there's also a consensus, Brian, to your point about infrastructure, right? We keep hearing about this one item that both parties agree on, but we somehow have never seen an infrastructure bill. There's also an agreement that we need quality jobs, domestic jobs, and try to reproduce that. That's sort of a bipartisan issue too. Absolutely, those are all tied together. If we could create a material recovery system, now granted, there's a bit of a contradiction because the more efficient you make, perhaps the less workers they require. But we produce so much trash that's almost irrelevant. You could hire thousands of workers if you actually had a functioning system here. And to the second part of your question, does anyone else do it? Belgium comes to mind. If anyone's been to Belgium, they have they have those 9 different bins, and at the end of the day, there's only so much they can do again because they're going to ship those recyclables and then downstream there are effects, but they're at least giving it a shot. They're giving those recyclables a chance of being recycled. There's some other people that would say Scandinavia, but there's argument about that because Scandinavia uses incineration a lot to also produce power, so it's complicated, but some countries in Western Europe are doing it. I'd have to look more into it. I'm sure it's not just Western Europe, but those are the ones that sort of get famously trotted out as better examples.
Well, thanks, David. I think we'll leave it there on the beyond context. Thanks for opening our eyes and showing the global challenges. fantastic questions in the chat that we'll capture and help to answer for everybody in some FAQs that will get posted online. We're close to a few wrap-up activities that are quick. I'm going to hand over to Susie, and we'll start to bring this home.
Great, thanks, Brian. Nicole, can you move to the next slide? Great. So if you noticed on the last two presentations we've done, we featured some artwork from the Smithsonian and from the Anchorage Museum, where artists who collect plastic waste. Oh, Nicole, you can leave it on that slide. Artists who collect plastic waste can do some great things in terms of raising awareness and using art as a technique to educate and motivate and inspire. So while we can't do a collective mural as a closeout, we did think we could bring back an old presentation trick, a word cloud that I know were all the rage maybe a few years ago, but we thought it could be a nice way to capture some of your just kind of more inspirational thoughts or dreams, and we can send this out after. So we're going to ask as our closing reflection, what's your wildest dream for a sustainable waste system, using just a few words? And so this is the thing where you can click on that link that Rebecca sent and add in your words. So think back on the discussions we've had, whether this is something that you might see show up in your own life or at the campus scale, or maybe in your town or globally, that you think would just be sort of like, you know, your vision, your mood board, your hopes and dreams about what that sustainable waste system will look like. And I will project on my screen the results of that. And we can kind of see some of the mural taking shape. So zero waste, absolutely. That's something we talked about the last time, and sort of it being a little bit of a trick to define that, getting really caught up on the definition. But I think as a concept, it's very powerful to just imagine a world where things are circular and where there is zero waste. So I see that word circular, one of Brian's favorite words, not a pun, a real word that he doesn't take lightly. Less packaging, absolutely. Community sharing. So community sharing, absolutely. I hope there's a world where there was so much effort and so much progress being made around sort of sharing. And I know we've seen some backsliding with the pandemic, but I hope that becomes just more and more present when we get through this public health crisis. Clean, conscience, reusing. Of course, if Ruth is still on the line, she's one of our the founders of Choose to Reuse, which Rebecca Fowler in my office also helps organize. Choose to Reuse, which is such a wonderful event that happens monthly, and we hope will happen again someday, right, Ruth?
Yes, we definitely hope it will happen again.
A future where we can go to Choose to Reuse. Who would have thought that would be such a highlight if we can imagine that? Education.
10-year run.
10 years. Oh my goodness. We'll have to have a huge party when we get back.
Right.
So equitable, I see justice, equity, right? Creating a world where the toll of our waste system isn't felt in our, isn't felt in communities that have traditionally been marginalized and disadvantaged. So keep the words coming in. We'll sort of send this out maybe as a memento for your parting gift from this, but we really appreciate everyone chiming in. And, you know, just to share a quick reflection, we were talking to some folks from Princeton University yesterday, and they had noted that some of their students in their dorm rooms, who are using disposables, and it's sort of like building up just around them, and how sort of in this world we've been living in for the past year, I think we can really see more, and we can really visualize just so much more clearly what the impact of our waste is, because we're kind of surrounded by it in this sort of more intimate way. So I think that really is an opportunity to be thinking, what do we want the future to hold? And how can we just take a more equitable and circular approach to this? So thanks for your contribution to this, and I'll turn it back over to Nicole. You can steal my screen.
So thanks all. We will be able to wrap up early. I'm going to share just a few quick takeaways. We've been on a journey together these past few weeks. I think we've learned that the system of waste is actually pretty complex. It appears simple, and it's got a lot of people involved. If you think of all the people that you've met during these 2 sessions, each one of these people plays a key role in the waste system at MIT. So we have a lot of great resources to tackle the challenge. It also takes a lot of different people with a lot of different roles. But by studying the system, that's where the opportunities lie. And we've identified a ton of opportunities. And oh my goodness, the students and your ideas and your presentations really shows that the future is thinking about these issues and tackling them. Individual differences, individual actions do make a difference. And that's important for us to keep in mind. For the person in the chat who said, is there something we can do for our office or for our department? If a department takes a lead in something and shows what's possible, other departments will follow. The rest of the institute can follow. So there's an opportunity to lead by example. And the Waste Watcher students are showing that clearly. And I think finally that if you haven't gotten the point, hopefully you've gotten it already, that we truly believe that the campus is a test bed for demonstrating these solutions. And these are global challenges. David has sort of blown our mind of what's out there, and it feels overwhelming. And David, it is kind of a downer, but the opportunity is we all have these incredible resources on campus and the campus itself to be a lab for testing and demonstrating potential solutions. And if some of those solutions stick and we've got some data that shows it, then that solution can start to spread and scale. So that's our opportunity. We thank you. I'm just going to hand off to Nicole to close with some of our next steps. But thanks again for your time and interest. And we welcome your outreach beyond this call to connect with us. Nicole.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. So we have been collecting all of the questions you've asked in the chat. If you've sent them into us, we're going to be pulling those together for our page on our website. Just to note, the recycling website through facilities does have a number of FAQs already addressed, but pulling together yours specifically to share on the Mitos website and also share back to you in email. So the email you registered for this with, we'll follow up with FAQs for you. We also have the recording from last week, 2 weeks ago, we already sent out. We'll have this recording up soon and we'll follow up on email, and you can respond to that email and our email address listed in there with any questions, comments, thoughts, going forward. So to echo what Brian said, thank you so much for coming out. I think this, everyone coming out was what makes this so special, and all of your questions and the great interaction. So thank you from me and the rest of our team, if they want to chime in or just wave.
We hope you don't feel like you've wasted your time. Thank you all for joining us.
And thanks to our many presenters for all of their time.
Team effort. We'll have to do it again soon. Thank you to everyone.